going to move on to the second session now. I do have some more poll questions, so if you go into Slido, you'll see some more questions that we've got available for you. We're going to be dealing in this session more about cyber resilience, so the questions I've got up on Slido deal with cyber resilience. Maybe we could switch over just briefly just to show you the questions. You can answer these questions. Again, I'll try and get you to answer these questions over the course of this next hour, and then we'll briefly run through them at the end during the panel session. And then, as I said before, the sessions, these questions, these poll answers will turn into a survey, which you can then download when we give you the link to download all the papers. So the sessions on cyber resilience is, how developed do you think is your company's cyber resilience? And I was asking that in terms of, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not very, and 10 is, yeah, we're super resilient. How cyber resilient is your company? The second question was, or is, has your company invested in cyber security tools? I wanted to look at a little bit about sort of the whether you've actually got a strategy. Have you invested in something? Maybe when I'm thinking about it now, I could have asked how or what kind of tools you've also invested in. What do you see as the biggest threats for cyber security in shipping? Somebody's already answered that. So those three questions then to look at during the course of this next session. And we'll go back and have a look at those questions when we come in. Don't forget, you can also ask questions, which I'll try and ask the panelists when we come to the panel session after the speakers. But we've got now a chance now to hear from Andrew Wadsworth, Managing Consultant at PA Consulting Group, looking at the NIS Directive and cybersecurity, and what you need to know from a ship perspective and port operations, because of course, as we'll hear more and more, that the ship and port operations and port connectivity is increasingly connected with each other. So Andrew, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Apologies for my voice, I'm on the back end of a cold, so my voice is a little bit croaky at the moment. My name's Andrew Wadsworth, I'm with PA Consulting. You can probably tell we're not the usual kind of consulting company because I'm wearing a brown suit, not a grey suit and a white shirt. But just a couple of quick questions, don't be shy about answering them. Who's heard of GDPR? Yeah, pretty much. Who's heard about the Network and Information Systems Directive before this was put up on the slide? Not many. In fact, no. Which is interesting because you probably know that GDPR comes into effect on the 28th of May this year. But the NIS Directive comes into effect on the 10th of May this year. Actually before. And GDPR has been getting all the attention, whereas NIS could, for reasons which I'll explain in a moment, could have a significant impact on your business, potentially as significant as GDPR. So, what is NIS? Well, basically, there's 1 month to go to become law. There's a difference between GDPR and NIS in that GDPR is a regulation, which means that each country does not have to enact it within their own legal framework, and it's applied equally across all the EU member states. A directive has to be transcribed into each member state's law by the 9th of May. So, what is it going to cover? Well, the first thing is it's going to cover what's called essential services. That is not the same as critical infrastructure. It's a term you might hear about, critical national infrastructure gets termed about things like power, grid and so on. A lot of CNI will be essential services, but it can cover other things as well. So first off, each state has to decide what does it deem to be an essential service. The second thing is, well, who actually are operators of essential services? So just because a service is deemed essential, not necessarily every company that supplies that service will be deemed an operator of essential service, because they may simply not be big enough to have a significant enough impact on social and economic well-being of the country to be included. The third thing is, this is where we start getting into the cyber security piece, is they define what's called a significant event. You've probably heard Facebook has had a significant event quite recently, or we're hearing a lot about it. So things like that would be a significant event, and if you, as an operator of an essential service, have one of those, you've got to report it to the authorities. And there will be a mechanism across the EU member states for that information to be shared, probably anonymised, between member states. So that because cybersecurity doesn't respect national boundaries, that information they want to share on be much more transparent amongst the member states. And then potentially, if you have such a significant event and you don't report it, you could get penalised. And there's other reasons why you might get penalised. And each country has to decide what the essential services are, who the operators are, what's a significant event, and what penalties they're going to apply. Now, because shipping industry works across national boundaries, so this potentially makes it very complex for the shipping industry. If you're a port, not so bad, because that doesn't move around, so you're only worried about the country in which you're located. But if you're a ship operator, what if you're a Danish shipping company that's a ship under the Bermudan flag, and you have a significant cyber event when you're in UK waters? What jurisdiction is going to apply there? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't again know there's the answer to that right now. Various things, all those aspects could be different depending on what country you're operating in. I'm going to talk about the UK approach to implementing the NIS. First headline is that the UK intends to follow the NIS directive even after we leave the European Union, so it will still apply. And they're applying it to harbour authorities and port operators. So it's basically the big ports. If you look at the criteria down here, it's the big ports. And these are ors, not ands down here. So a port that covers 15% of roll-on, roll-off, or 20% of UK biomass fuel. Quite why they're so interested in biomass fuel, I don't know, but that's what they've decided. Then you would be within the scope of an essential service. On the passenger and freight side, it's basically, again, it's the big ones. Operators that handle more than 30% of freight at an individual port that is covered by these, so in scope. So you could be 30% or more of the freight at another port, but you wouldn't be providing an essential service. You wouldn't be an operator of essential services. Or that you've got more than 2 million passengers total, or 5 million tonnes in the UK. It's where the penalties get interesting. So an OES, which is an operator of an essential service, the UK has said you've got to be looking to comply with the NIS directive from the 10th of May, and notionally there is no grace period. From 10th of May you could be non-compliant and you could be penalised. In practice, the expectation is that they're going to be lenient is probably the wrong word, but at least take into account the fact that it has only just come into force. The National Cyber Security Centre, which is an arm of the intelligence services, has issued general guidance for businesses about how to comply with NIS. And then there will be something called a competent authority that regulates each industry sector. So the Department for Transport is the UK competent authority for maritime, and they will issue specific guidance for the sector, probably later this year. This is where it gets really interesting, is that if you incur a significant event, however that's defined, you have 72 hours to report it from when you become aware. That's the same as GDPR. 72 hours is the deadline for a breach of GDPR. And the penalties can be up to £17 million for non-compliance. It's basically the same as GDPR, except that we don't have the 4% global revenue limit as well, which was proposed by the UK government, but everybody kicked up such a fuss in the consultation, they took that out. So what should you be doing about it? The first thing you need to look at is the scope of applicability, i.e., are you covered by NIS in each of the countries in which you operate? One of the key things will be, where do you have your controlling office, the head office, if you like, that controls your operations? That's the country that you will be most interested in terms of how they are implementing this. And there's not much information out there, but we do know that member states are taking a very different approach to how they implement the directive. Having done that, you then need to look at, well, which of my services are actually covered by this? Because it may not be everything that you do, or everywhere that you do it. Next thing you need to look at is a gap and a risk assessment. So look at what the guidance is, what the expectations are, and where do you stand against that. Identify your gaps and assess what a risk that is. And one of the key ones will be, can I actually recognise a significant event and report it within 72 hours? And a lot of companies, when we look at them on the GDPR context, have been overly optimistic about their capability of doing that. And I think the same will apply to this. Then got to design an improvement program to address any gaps that you've identified, execute the program. The key one, coming back to this incident reporting, is making sure that you have the mechanisms in place to pick up a significant event, filter it through the organisation, triage it to say, is that one that is covered by NIS, and report it to the appropriate people. And practice that, exercise it. And then assurance at the end, because at some point a company is going to get stung by this, and then boards are going to start asking questions of CIOs, CISOs and the like. What's our position on this? So if you can get assurance before that, you can say to the board, we've looked at it, this is the information we've got, we believe we are in good shape. The rest of my presentation, which I'm not going to go through, which if you download it, is just more information about PA, because I suspect a lot of you either never heard of us or don't before. Just out of interest, who has heard of PA Consulting before? 2. So there you go. So we are different to the big boys. So some more information on that. Thank you.
So NIS, nobody had heard of NIS then. Andrew, did that surprise you?
I'm surprised it was none, but I'm not surprised that it wasn't them.
So with that in mind, I'm going to invite Martin Steimer up now from Fraunhofer to come up, and we're going to look now at the Mitigate project, looking at cyber risks, particularly within the maritime supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I was asked to give a very short and brief overview about a research project from the European Union. We do this with 14 academic and industrial partners, and it's about cyber and risk management in the maritime supply chain. And first, from motivation. Why to deal with cyber risk assessment and management? According to a study from the Allianz SE, the Allianz Risk Barometer 2018, they have asked over 1,900 risk managers and experts what they think is the most important business risk. And so cyber incidents are still the second most important business risk for them. And business interruptions are the most or the highest business risk, but the cyber incidents are still the most feared trigger for it. And yes, also cyber incidents are also considered as the most underestimated risk. Next, I want to show you a chart of the National Vulnerability Database from the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. And you can see the count over here of vulnerabilities and the severity. As you can see, in 2017, there are still over 14,000 vulnerabilities in the world. And the last on the right, you see, is for it's for 2018. So the first 3 months, we are still over 3,000 vulnerabilities or known vulnerabilities. Okay, but why to deal with vulnerabilities? What can an attacker do? If you're considering business partners with only 3 assets, for example, asset A1, a web application, A2, Apache server or web server, and A3, operating system, which means you can see it as asset A1 is installed on A2 and A2 is installed on A3, so on a physical machine. You see there are vulnerabilities and possibilities to get from one vulnerability to another vulnerability. And so the concept of attack path means that you can have different entry points and possibilities to get to your target. In this example, the target is the vulnerability E6 in asset A3. But you don't need to get there directly. Maybe it's very secured, but you can go through the network of the vulnerabilities as an attacker can do. For example, assessing asset A1 and then routes to the assets A3 over asset A2. So what I want to say with this is analysis of recent attacks shows, like NotPetya last year, companies are networked in supply chains not only on a process level but also on a cyber asset level. And due to the ongoing digitalization we are talking about today, the network will increase more and more. And therefore we need a cyber risk assessment which takes into account the network partner and also the network partner systems. So we try to develop a suitable methodology based on publicly available information, some mathematical approaches, best practices to identify vulnerabilities and threats, and qualitative risk scales, as well as dependencies between business partners. So to get a more holistic view over the whole supply chain and not only over one company's assets. In a short or in a nutshell, the methodology consists of 6 steps. So first you have to define your scope. What do you want to look at your cyber risk assessment? So choosing a supply chain service or a process. Then you have to analyze which business processes are connected with supply chain services, as well as which cyber assets, software or hardware, and which business partners are involved in this. And if you get this, you can see what cyber threats might strike you, which could damage your systems, and based on this, what vulnerabilities are in the systems or in the cyber assets. And based on that, you can do an impact analysis to see, okay, what are the important systems I need to protect first, which are less important, or which systems might be less important but still connected, as you have seen in the attack path example. Yes, and based on this you can do a risk assessment to have some information to assess the risk, and on this you can do a mitigation strategy. Because you have the information to do a good mitigation strategy and think about how to mitigate the risks on a reasonable level. Of course, there's no total security, but you have to find a good level of security. And okay, in the project, of course, we haven't only developed a methodology, but also a prototype to implement this methodology. And so, as I said, it's just a short brief overview. Some of the features are the cloud-based technology to improve the collaboration between business partners, the management and mapping of processes, assets, networks, and known vulnerabilities. Of course, you have to have them in the mitigate systems or in your risk assessment system to get the connections between them. And then we have the concept of cyber dependencies to business partners, as well as, of course, reports and visualizations, for example, for the attack paths shown before and assets per process, as well as automatic filtering and updating of known vulnerabilities for the assets involved in the cyber risk management system, to keep them up to date. And last but not least, the system also provides decision support. For example, you can do a risk assessment, then think about your mitigation strategy and try as a what-if analysis, what would happen if I change this asset to a more secure asset? What's the overall benefit from this? So you can compare between real risk assessments and simulated ones. Okay, and as I have said, this is a research project, but the developing partners of the project are planning to develop the system further. And some of the planned improvements are the integration of an interface or data exchange format to third-party inventory management tools or PPNM tools, just to facilitate the asset setups and management. Actually, they are working at this right now, and of course, further usability optimization based on the pilot users' feedbacks. We have extended pilot user operations to get this feedback, and so it will be improve the system. And yes, last but not least, enhanced reports and visualization with new views to improve the decision support for finding optimal mitigation strategies. Yes, thank you very much.
Good, thank you much. Could I just ask you to take us down there and ask Andrew and also Michael to come forward and sit at the front. I don't believe that Oksana is here yet. No. She did say that she might not be able to make it before lunchtime. We will hear from her later this afternoon, so it won't be too much. Well, hopefully too long before we see her in the room. Now, we're going to go through this panel. We're going to go to some of the poll questions in a minute, but there was a couple of white papers that I've read recently, and it deals with a lot to do with cybersecurity and perhaps vulnerabilities. And one of the takeaways from a white paper I read recently, for something I was writing about, was how determined cyber criminals are when they do deliberate attacks, and they are now developing the capabilities to have cyber attacks to the cloud rather than into specific premises. Is that an issue that is going to be more prevalent within the whole of the industry over the course of 2018? And is it something that we'll see becoming a problem within the transport sector, namely the maritime shipping and port logistics sector? Yes?
I definitely think yes, definitely. And the problem might be that some companies were already under attack, but they haven't realized it. Because, of course, you can do much damage with a cyber attack, but also you can just get information or manipulate information, and these attacks are sometimes not seen right at the moment. So Yes, it's a major problem, and it will increase, from my opinion, definitely.
Michael?
I think first of all, I appreciate especially your comments on talking about cyber risk and not only cyber security, because I think that is an important differentiation. We have in CRM a working group on cyber risk. We first had talked about how to create a cyber security working group, and then we discussed it internally and decided it's actually about cyber risk and not about security. Cyber security is a result of doing mitigations for cyber risks. Well, I worked for more than 20 years in a company which belonged to the Boeing organization, and Boeing does have on a weekly basis more than 1,000 attacks. I think what we have to realize is when we're talking about cyber threats I see mainly 3 levels. The one are accidents, so to speak. So the classic example we have on shipping, when the shipmaster wants to charge his cell phone, put it in the USB stick or in the USB entrance of the active system, and the active breaks down. That was not an attack; it was an accident or a wrong usage, which created a cyber threat, which caused all of the access navigation system on the bridge to shut down. That is the one level. The other level is the ones which are going in and trying to harvest data. You may not see them, they don't want you to see them, so they are going in and they are actually trying to extract your data. They want to know what do you have on blueprints, what do you have on business data available, to take advantage of that. And they are doing everything that you do not identify them as attacks. And then you have the attacks like what Maersk was doing, whether that is ransomware or something else. They do want to be seen and they do want to destroy something in your area to get you on the attack. And these are 3 different levels of cyber risk which you have to keep in mind. And to that specific question, of course, when you are working on the cloud has its own cyber risks. The myth, what I think we have, especially in the marine world, is to say, I'm taking care of my server and then I'm secure. As long as I'm not uploading it, as long as I am secure. That is wrong. So cyber risk is not only when you go to the cloud, then you have to see who is the one who is actually providing the services, what is their cyber risk mitigation on the cloud, what is the security there. But just because you are not using the cloud doesn't mean you have reduced cyber risk.
When it comes to the NIS in this, I am aware, I've read a lot about national attacks. There are certain countries that are having rather large attacks towards other nation states, and the accusations are there against North Korea, Iran, Russia, and attacks on Western democracies. If you described in that NIS, you described some critical infrastructure as being important to that. Can I imply then that some of this critical infrastructure, ports, some of the major shipping companies, are at risk from some of those national cyber elements that I've just referenced?
Absolutely. Just come back to the previous one, just very briefly. I actually really quite dislike the term cyber risk, because actually what we're talking about is business risk. It's just another business risk, and shouldn't be seen as a separate way, in the same way that financing is a business risk and so on. And cloud, if you're using a technology, it can be attacked. So if you're using it, it's for potential attack. To come back to the point that you just made about nation states, etc., it's not necessarily nation states either. Cyber attacks are being commercialised, industrialised. So if for really remarkably small amounts of money, you can pay other people to create attacks for you and execute attacks. on your behalf. So terrorist organisations, pirates, they have the resources to get, you don't necessarily have the technical resources, but they have the financial resources to go and get somebody to do this for them. And the evidence is that basically if you do something which is of value, then you will get attacked. James Comey, CIA Director, ex, once said there's two types of companies. There's those that have been hacked and those that don't know that they've been hacked. And a lot of companies don't actually know how much they are under attack already.
So do you think there's a lot of companies, when they don't know that they are, I was going to use the word blissfully ignorant then, but they are, if they don't know they've been attacked, then they don't know what they've lost? Or what?
I think that's reducing considerably. The high-profile events like Facebook, etc., and WannaCry last year affected Maersk. I mean, they came out publicly and said it cost them $300 million on their bottom line to sort that out. I think there's much greater awareness of the risk. Whether people have got put in the resources and the expertise, and have got the expertise and capability to really find out what their vulnerabilities are, is a moot point.
But a large company, Boeing, for example, getting, how many did you say? Thousands
a week.
Thousands.
I'm surprised it's as little as that, actually.
Yeah, well, these are the big ones, the military type of attacks, not the regular ones.
A large company like Boeing can afford, I would imagine, the kind of cyber resilience that we talk about to withstand that level of bombardment of attacks. But what about smaller companies that don't have the financial resources? We heard earlier this morning that a lot of the German ship owners are small family-owned companies that only have operations maybe 3, 4, 5 vessels. And they've got to comply with a lot of increasing, or not comply, but they're competing in an industry that is becoming more and more digitalised. There's the expectation that they will be part of this transformation of the industry somehow, but how do they afford the kind of resilience that we're talking about that a large company, a Boeing or a Maersk, can afford, and in Maersk's case say, well, we still succumbed?
I think one of the things we have to keep in mind that a large amount of work to be done to reduce your cyber risk is on procedures. Tools are there, yes, and you need to build tools and you need to have tools available, but still a lot of risk is there because you're using wrong procedures. If you leave around your password, then you have a serious risk. So one of the things we put in the guidance we are right now building together with BIMCO on cyber risk mitigation is built more or less similar to what you were saying, is you have to build procedures so the systems can protect you. Still, a lot of attacks are for social engineering, because that is the easiest way to go in if you are behind the firewall because you have a password.
Social engineering, what do you mean?
Social engineering is when you're going out, and you explain it better, but when you're going out and you're trying to find out an identity and a password so you can get behind the firewall.
So this is what phishing is all about?
It is. It's manipulating the human.
Okay.
So it's ringing up the help desk and saying my password's expired, I can't get in, because you managed to find somebody's name, and they go, okay, it is now what day is it? Tuesday 2 is the new password. Thank you very much, and you go in. So you've manipulated the help desk.
Exactly, and then you're behind the firewall, and all your technical protection doesn't help you because you're inside. And I think that is something which also smaller companies need to recognize, that they are sometimes used to get access to others. So you're trying to find, similar to like if a thief comes, he tries to find where he can break in the house. And it may not be the front door because that is good protected, but the bathroom window may just be open, And though you go in and says, well, which of the supplier of your company has a low-profile security? How can I go into that and then use their VPN to go to other sites?
Well, an example of that is Target supermarket chain in the US. Lost, I think, 70 million customer accounts. because they were hacked by the company that maintained the air conditioning systems in their shops.
So the company that did the air conditioning in all of these stores
Yes, was attacked, and through the link that they had to maintain and monitor the HVAC systems in the shops, which Target also had access to those systems. They bridged basically into Target.
So is there an implication then? Is there a liability that we should look at then when it comes to your suppliers having a weak resilience? If you're having a contract with a supplier for services, if they've got a weak resilience, do we need to build up some sort of contractual stipulation here?
The UK implementation of NIS, they've explicitly said you are responsible for your supply chain. So there's a weakness in your supply chain, it's you that they'll go after, not the supply chain.
So if I am a transportation company, then it's my responsibility. I can't go after the person who has a weak backdoor.
So what bigger companies often do is that they are just giving outside company suppliers no access to their internals. They are just putting everything what is to a degree necessary on behind firewalls with specific access, but not within their main arena. So going to shipping, perhaps, to put it in, what we are discussing with PIMCO, for example, when you go to a ship, you may have different layers of cyber security in it. Your navigation system has a certain layer, your crew system has a different layer, and the social networking system you have for your customers on a cruise ship has another layer of it. And the more essential those tools are for the operating of the ship, the more protected they need to be in order to mitigate those risks. That's again going back what you were saying, you have to do your risk assessment, and then you can do your risk mitigation. And
none of that is new.
Yeah, absolutely not.
Other industries have been doing that for 10, 15 years, looking at it in that way. And actually, I've been involved in hundreds of risk assessments, and there is a danger of overcomplicating it. Because if you go to a ship's captain, or whatever, he knows which of the critical systems are operating in. You don't have to do an awful lot of risk assessment to know that your steering, your navigation, your propulsion systems, and ballast control are probably the 4 most important systems on a ship. You don't have to do a big exercise to know that. They're the ones you really want to protect more than anything else.
So is there, Martin, when it comes to looking at the Mitigate project, when you're looking at how we move on with that project, in other words, how we evolve even within the industry, do you see there has to be the decision of how we, as Michael said, how we separate different parts of the digital eco-structure or the ecology around a shipping company, that they're kind of separated so that there is a less likelihood that if there is a breach in one area that it doesn't happen in another area. We silo the digital capabilities in a way.
Actually, this would be a good countermeasure or control based on your mitigation strategy, which is based on your impact analysis and your assets. So, of course, you have to look when does it make sense to separate networks. Generally, it's a very good idea. But if it's only for less important things, maybe you can invest your money in better strategies to get a better security level. So I think there's no one fitting answer for it, but you have to mitigate this about helping you to find good personalized mitigation strategies. So
I'm going to go over to the poll now. I think if we could just move over to the poll questions and just give everybody, if you haven't answered the poll questions, we'll come through to them in a minute. Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question. You talk a lot about the risk to the business of cyber threats, but I think there's another risk, which is talking about when we set up these processes and these security systems and kind of close them off, we will also close them off to internal innovation. We will close certain people off internally. We will close certain people off externally. And how do we balance the risk of some competitor being more innovative because they have more freedom to act and the need for the cybersecurity.
I think I'll ask Michael to ask that first before I do.
I think that goes back to what you were saying, it cannot be too complicated. So it's always a cost and a benefit. For everything what you do, whether that is on your financial side, whether that is on your business assessment side, or whether that is on your cyber risk assessment side. You only can be absolutely sure if you disconnect with all and everything, and even there you have difficulties. But that means you can no longer do business. Now, a ship is only safe for grounding if you moor it somewhere where you don't have tides or something like that. But then it's not an asset for you anymore. So you always have to assess risk versus benefit. And then you need to mitigate the risk that it doesn't get fatal for you and that you can recover from risk. I think that this assessment is, I think, essential before you go ahead and starting to do any mitigation plans. The same when you have, like when you try to secure your house. Of course, if you put walls all around, no doors, no windows, you're secure, but you cannot use it. Well, it's always a mitigation.
Andrew?
I've been involved in, my particular focus area is control system security. The systems that run nuclear power stations, trains, etc., oil platforms, ships. But I think, and I've been involved in it for over 10 years now, I think there's been a big shift in the last few years that most security professionals these days recognise that they can't just say no. You can't do that. The attitude of, at least the ones that has shifted to, is maybe not that way, but let's figure out a way that we can do it managing the risk and maintaining the security. And in fact, a lot of what the work we've done in the control systems area is making sure that we secure those systems, we protect them, but we enable the data to get out of those systems, sometimes data getting in, but it's more often out of those systems, so that you can do the business analytics, you can do the smart decision making, remote performance monitoring, remote diagnostics, all those good things that you can do. So I think if a security professional just turns around and says, no, you can't do that because it's not secure, find another.
Can I ask a question? A lot of money can be spent on looking at the security against cyber attack and along with all the other things that we spend money on. For me, we sort of proceed on the basis that we will be attacked. I mean, there is no defence against a determined hacker, and all of our businesses at some stage will be attacked. What I don't hear enough of at these sort of conferences is the actual response. Putting together a policy for the company of how to deal with a cyber attack and minimise business disruption, because we will be attacked. And it's a case of if you have policies in place to deal with that, you minimise the damage caused, you still allow the business to function. Actually, so what? Data will escape, you have a policy in place, you show you have a policy in place, you carry on business, and it's the business disruption that's important certainly to me.
So there's two elements to that. One is you need to be able to detect that you've got an attack. So sometimes there is some technologies and stuff that you do need to put into at least give you indicators which says this is something you need to look at further. And the second is exactly an incident response plan, which isn't about how do I restore the data to this server, it's how do I manage the incident. And sometimes that's not just a technical side, that can be legal people, it can be PR. I'm sure Maersk's PR people were involved when WannaCry was breaking out. How do we manage this, our image to our customers and public and regulators and so on. And actually, a little plug, PA developed for the UK government a one-day incident response training.
But Maersk's loss wasn't the fact that they got attacked, it was the lack of response.
Yes.
And they've sacked countless IT people and employed thousands of others. They're still exposed to precisely the same attack that happened before. The difference is they now have a response that will enable them to carry on business and not be totally. disruptive performance. I
And
guess.
an awful lot of companies do not have a good incident response plan in place.
I think when we are talking about cyber risk mitigation plans, it's exactly that. You need to, first is to avoid cyber risk, but then what do you do if you get attacked? Because you're absolutely right, you will, period. So that is part of the procedures you could put in place to contain that. It is similar to the procedures countries have in place on, we say, on viruses or something which are breaking out on illnesses and so on and so forth. And how do we contain it? Do we put the people in a quarantine room or something like that? You need to do the same thing on your system when you know which effect it may have if something happens.
Or like when my kids had chicken pox, all the neighbours' kids came round and played.
Yeah, or
became resilient because they were able to understand what it was, or their bodies were able to.
Unfortunately, I think the resilience we have in our body does not necessarily work with the cyber systems.
There's some interesting technologies around that. Very similar.
Yes, I just wanted to come to the one of the poll questions here. Okay, only 19 people in the room have answered this out of about 40, but the generic response when I asked the question, how developed is your company's cyber resilience, was 7.5 out of 10. Do you think there's an over-optimism in that answer?
Every company I've been into is over-optimistic about their situation. Now you might say that, I'll say that because I'm a consultant, but genuinely I do feel people tend to overestimate.
Is that your thoughts as well, Michael?
100%. Own experience, just a short example, not really attack, next incident. We had in the company our database secured in a specific box with own security, with the computers in there all mounted together and so on and so forth. And then the electrician exchanged 220 to 350 volt and all the computer system died. You know, we thought we are 99% safe until somebody does something which we haven't seen as a threat. Yeah. And that is the problem. If you doesn't see it as a threat, then it can be fixed.
There was a story I heard from one of the class societies late last year or mid last year about a super yacht in Greece that's basically the air conditioning in the super yacht was controlled remotely, and the manufacturer basically sent an automatic update for the air conditioning, which basically just very briefly shut all the air conditioning, and that included the vent into the engine room. The engine overheated and the ship blacked out, just based on the air conditioning being upgraded. Have you seen that there's a lot of over-optimism?
I definitely think yes, as you have said already, but I have the hope that the awareness rises.
Do you see that with Mitigate? Have you found more companies are getting engaged with things like Mitigate, are getting engaged with the conversation? And while we see the discussion about the digitalisation and the transformation reaching board level, the cyber resilience issue is going higher up the chain as well.
Well, yes, but from my own experience, I think now everybody is talking in the branch about digitalization, but maybe security is the next point they want to talk about, or they are already starting to talk about, but I think it's most about security by design. If you're starting to implement new systems and software or whatever, new business models, you have to take the security in mind from the start, and so you will get better systems, and not if the system is running over the decade, and then think about how to secure it. If you think about this from the start and make well-informed informations or decisions, like with the cyber risk assessment, of course you can say, I know this risk, but I will take it. Okay, but then you have made a decision and not only react on attacker. So yes, and you have your plans, hopefully, and that's about cyber risk management.
Can I suggest that the same way as digitalisation, you have to start with an agenda and a vision. The best way to start with cyber is try and get insured for it. you sit down with your underwriters and try and get an insurance policy, they will say, well, what's your cyber risk policy? What's your critical information? What are the key areas that you want to protect against? Because otherwise the premium will be through the roof. So you want to minimise your risk zones, your critical risk zones, to allow the business to continue, just to be able to afford the insurance. And that then puts together the policy, and it's a bit like getting through that writer's block that I talked about with visualization. So it's a good way to start. Actually sit down with your insurance underwriter and say, here's my problem, what's it going to cost me to insure this business against cyber attack?
Well, I have seen that organisations like IUMI have taken a much more robust approach towards cyber resilience or cyber security, and it's become an issue in their agendas when they have their annual meeting. It's becoming a regular content in their meetings because they see that. But I also get the impression sometimes with the insurance industry they don't quite understand the risks themselves, and if they don't understand the risks, they themselves don't know how to proportion the premium on the risk. But I think they are getting more and more engaged with that though.
And watch out for clause 380, exclusions.
And I see a similar development on the cyber risk side right now than what we have on the quality side. You know, we started off with about 20, 30 years ago, where companies are starting to envision that quality in their products and quality in their procedure is quite good. So they started to get a quality system in place, an ISO certified quality system, until the time when that reaches the board. Actually, the board needs to make their decisions based on having quality in mind. On the cyber security, I see it similar. You know, you start to get some awareness, then you get a security officer in place. He should handle it. We do have nothing to do with it. He will do it, and you try to offload it. But that is not how it works. It needs to be within your decisions. So it needs to reach the board, who actually decides on business decisions, taking cyber risk, cyber security in account. And that's a development I see right now developing.
So these are all of the answers actually haven't appeared on the board, but when I asked what do you see the biggest threats are for cybersecurity in shipping, the answers here are connected systems and users, humans, ignorance of data system users, too many independent data sources and very few integration efforts, the human element, human error, again, the user, similar answer, data corruption and data stealing, theft, people, again, awareness with crew, needs of always online in a secure manner, GPS dependence for almost all vital systems on board, no sufficient procedures to mitigate cyber risk, and again, ignorant staff, ignorance. And humans.
I'd add ignorant management to that as well.
Good. We are bang on 12 o'clock. Does anybody else have a question or a thought or a comment here on this topic? All finished. Good. Lunch.
It's in the restaurant.
It's in the restaurant, is it?
Yes. I was just inquiring if it's whereabouts. It's in the restaurant.
I didn't have there last time. Okay, lunch is in the restaurant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the panel. Thank you.